Good afternoon. This is Shirley Brown. I've been a master gardener since 2015, and I'm going to be talking about the Irish Potato Famine, which started up where they say it started at 1845 and it went through 1852. So I have lots of slides and went on a lot of rabbit trails, so I want to be able to help you understand all of the different aspects of the potato famine. So I think the first thing we need to do is have a little bit of chuckles. It's like the baking potatoes. You kids poke yourself a few times so you don't explode. Yeah, Mom. And I think this second one is something that we might have more and more. It says, I've been afraid you've been a couch potato for too long. So that might pertain to some during the coronavirus episode here. So hopefully you're not growing sprouts. One of the things that I want to do is to let you know what was happening before the potato famine happened. So in 1801, Ireland was elevated to the position of a full-fledged member of the United Kingdom, and the Irish were treated as inferior by the British. Great Britain had a policy of laissez-faire, which was let them do as he will, leave him alone, and so the government never interfered with any economic affairs. Those who believed in the laissez-faire capitalism objected to the government interference with the trade between England and Ireland. People pressed the British to stop the exports and feed the hungry on the island. Such actions were considered government interference in the rights of the wealthy landlords as they saw fit with their produce from their lands. The landlords wanted to make a profit from their wealth. That also was his right, even if the people harvesting it were starving. The British government didn't stop the exports, and many of the Irish peasants starved as the bounty of the Irish soil was loaded onto the ships bound for overseas markets. So there was, in 1839, a French traveler, Gustave de Beaumont, wrote a book, and it was very interesting. It's said that the Irish country was well known for its beauty, which it is. But then he wrote also the disturbing critique of the British policy in Ireland. He questions the government with such educated institutes that tolerated such oppression. Gustave noticed that the devastating state of Ireland as it was in the basic poverty, there was unfair labor landlord systems, the fault of the upper class, repeated famines, and the Irish were seen as loafers, drunks, and bullies when they had been reduced to living like beasts. Poor people in the cities were wearing ragged clothes, they were begging for food, and the people in the countryside lived in run-down one-room cabins that were made of mud. No windows or chimneys, and several generations lived together. No furniture, and they shared a single straw mattress. Great Britain was the wealthiest and the most powerful nation in 1845. They had some of their borders included parts of Africa, parts of North America, the Hong Kong, Australia, India, and Ireland. So there was quite a bit of wealth all over the world through them. The importance of the potato was a key part of their diet, and the Ireland's best land was reserved for growing grains for the landlords, and so the poor were forced to grow their own food on thin rocky soils or on the mountainsides. The potatoes were hardy crops. Tiny patches of poor soil could grow plenty of potatoes to feed themselves for almost a year. The potatoes were dipped in buttermilk, which was a basic product of the butter making process. They couldn't afford to raise a cow or to buy buy butter or fresh milk, but those that could buy a cow, they would make butter and then sell it to the wealthier people. There was no refrigeration, so the milk had to be turned into the butter or into cheese. And the byproduct of making the butter was buttermilk, which provided the nutrients such as fat and vitamin A that the potatoes lacked. So the poorest people were forced to go hungry every year during the so-called hungry months. From June through August, the potato plants were too young to produce food, so the pigs would be sold or slaughtered for meat. They survived on meager diet of fish, garden vegetables, seaweed until the first potatoes were ready to harvest in early fall. There was interesting nutritional value of a potato. As you can see, it has vitamin C, protein, fat, fiber, carbohydrate, calcium, potassium, phosphorus, iron, niacin, thiamine, and riboflavin, and it gave them a lot of energy. So the potatoes were not native to the Ireland, but they thrived in Ireland's climate. So growing potatoes on an acre, an Irish family could eat for an entire year, or almost an entire year. They fed their livestock, the pig, cows, and chickens, the potato scraps. In 1845, the families ate potatoes for breakfast, lunch, and supper from August until May. They ate potatoes boiled, roasted, mashed with buttermilk and onions, which sounds very good, potato cakes, potato bread, and potato soups. In 1845, about 1/3 of the Ireland's farmland was used for potato crops. They planted a variety called lumpers, and it's not the most nutritional kind of potato, but it did end up having a large harvest. The lumper potatoes variety arrived in Ireland after 1810, and it grew very well, even in the poor soil. So when they plant the potatoes, they put a potato into the ground that has an eye on it, and then you can see the stem coming up, and then they keep mounding the dirt up so it keeps growing. So they planted them in March, usually around Good Friday, as we say here in the United States, and harvested in September or October. And the potatoes kept until July the following years. So the potato crop in 1845 were watched very close because the crops failed in years past because of disease and poor weather. Well, the weather during the summer of 1845 was the worst that the oldest person could remember. July's days were much hotter than usual, and then the hot spell ended and the weather was gloomy and cold and damp, and then 3 weeks into August they had heavy rains, fell every single day. Well, there were rumors in August that the crops had failed in southern England. Well, in September, when Ireland was doing their harvest, the potatoes looked good, but within days they turned a slimy black and smelly. And the second year of the blight in 1846 was much worse. So this is what the fungus-like organism calls Phytothoria, which spread throughout Ireland. The blight caused the potato to rot and die. Microorganisms were related to the mushrooms and mold, and the fungus grew on the underside of the infected plant, blackened and shriveled leaves. The wind blew, released all these millions of spores and tiny seed-like particles into the air. It was also spread by the rain and, of course, the wind, and then insects. So in 1845, the infestation ruined up to 1/2 of the potato crop that year. The next 7 years, 3/4 of the crop was destroyed. The blight was originally native to Mexico, and researchers say that the fungus likely traveled north to the United States or Canada first, then crossed the Atlantic to Ireland. Potato blight had destroyed crops in the eastern United States in 1843 to 1844, which I did not know about until I did the research. So this was an article that was in the Gardener's Chronicles, and just to point out some things, and they say we stopped the press with a great regret, and so they were on the end of the article. It says, for where will Ireland be in the event of a universal potato rot? And so this was publicized, and they knew something was going on in Ireland. There were 3 different classes in Ireland. The land system was divided into the 3 classes, and the first class was the wealthy and powerful landowners, and they were the landlords. Most landlords lived in England and never saw their land. They hired agents to manage their estate, never improved the property, so many fell into disrepair. Landlords sent agents to manage the landlord estate and collect the rent money. Family grew small wheat crops that would pay the rent. Keepers were sent to guard the crops and would stay in the family home until the wheat was threshed and bagged and taken to the mill. Well, the keepers would take all of the money for the rent, and the family who lost their potato crop now have no money. After the crop failure, the landlords fear the tenants wouldn't pay, so they would confiscate their livestock and grain crops as payment. The second class was the tenant farmers. They were classified according to how much land they held. So the large farmers rented about 30 or more acres. They made a comfortable living from dairy and livestock farming, and they sold harvest to pay rent. They were required to pay taxes to support the local workhouses, which provided shelter and food for the poor. And we're going to be talking more about the workhouses later on. Middling farmers rented between 10 and 30 acres, and they too were required to pay taxes to support the local workhouses. And then the small farmers rented about 2 to 10 acres, and so they were all required to pay taxes to help the workhouses. The third class is the farm laborers. They rented the land ranging from 1/8 to 1 acre. And in rural areas, 2 million laborers spoke Irish. It was the language of honor, the language at the table, at the milking house, of sowing and reaping, of mowing, of language of the harvest home. They only spoke English when the landlord or the government authorities came around. So I thought that was interesting. They wanted to keep that culture. Children attended school called hedge schools, usually outside in warm days, but on cold and rainy days they were held in scalps or mud cabins or farmers' barns, and we're going to talk about the scalps too later on. Some of the landlords created schools on their estate for the tenant schools to attend. The boys received more education than girls. More children attended the school in the summer since winter they lacked warm clothing. 30 students shared 8 spelling books and 4 reading primers and a handful of catechism books. Parents paid quarterly fees to the schoolmaster, ranged it was about 46 cents for reading and spelling to about 93 cents for arithmetic. Some parents paid in turf, butter, eggs, and provided him with lodging and meals. The national school system was established in 1831, and it provided free primary education. But the Irish language was forbidden and English history was replaced the Irish history in the curriculum. So you can see how important it was for the Irish, the third class or the poorest class, to keep that language going and for them to pass that on to the next generation. The laborers were expected to work for the farmer or landlord, even if it meant neglecting their own crops at planting or harvest time. Laborers lived in 1 or 2 room mud cabins, which they built with straw and clay for the thick walls, and thatched roof and tempered clay floors. 2 families usually shared a cabin, and a bundle of straws or thick mattress stuffed with chaff or rags served as the bed. Animals, the chicken and pigs, often shared the living space. This was very interesting. The pigs were jokingly referred to as the gentlemen who paid the rent, since money earned from the pig sale at market was put towards the rent. Tenants paid high rent twice a year at Gale Day, which is just after the first grain harvest in May and the last potato harvest in November. Small farmers and laborers considered it was a miracle if they managed to cover the rent. Rent was demanded, and in some cases there were evictions. Evicted tenants found shelter with neighbors or worked traveling from farm to farm looking for work. Only found work during the planting and harvest season, which is about 5 to 6 months each year. The Irish laborers married young, girls as young as 16 and boys were slightly older. Newly married couples moved into a small mud cabin, which they were built on a small patch of land and furnished only with a pot, stool, and maybe a straw bed. The Irish liked large families. Children cared for their aged parents, who usually lived with the youngest child. So this is a scalp. This is a scalp of Brian Connor. A scalp is basically a hole in the earth about 2 to 3 feet deep. It had a roof of sticks, pieces of turf that were laid in the shape of an inverted saucer. The wind could not penetrate those walls, and they were warm and cozy. Brian and his family of 3 lived in this hole several months before it was discovered. Bog squatters lived in hunts on the swampy bog, and sunken huts that were barely distinguishable. This is another picture of the scalps. So there was famine in the midst of plenty. Many people died of starvation. More common famine victims died from the disease that was widespread when population is weakened by severe malnutrition. No lack of food in Ireland during the Great Famine. Ireland's farms produced an abundance of crops other than potatoes, wheat, oats, barley, pigs, sheep, and cows, which were all exported to England and other parts of the British Empire. So the hungry months, we talked a little bit about that, where the potatoes didn't last from season to season. They only lasted about 9 months. In May, the families ate the last of their stored potatoes, and they faced the summer months as time of hardship since the crop weren't ready yet, and so they called them the hungry months. During those hungry months, men and older boys left home to look for farm work, often traveling as far as England. The women, girls, and younger children stayed home, tending their small garden and picking the nettles and berries and wild cabbage to eat. Poorest begged from place to place, but not near their homes. At the last resort, they went to the local workhouse, which was called the poorhouse, and we're going to be talking about that. So in 1845, the crop failure, people foraged at night to hide their shame at not having enough food. And when they grew excessively hungry, the men used to steal the tails of the young bulls or castrated steers. They would cut off the tails, would skin them, and roast them. There was also people that the men would hold a cow, the other would cut a vein in its neck and drain off a few pints of blood into a vessel or a leather pouch, then pin the incision closed. Cows weren't hurt from the bleeding, and the woman fried mushrooms and cabbage to cook in its black pudding. Blood was a source of protein and iron, and it was served as a meat substitute. Wintertime, the cost of flour, oatmeal, and other food skyrocketed, and the merchants and the storekeepers bought up the flour and oatmeal, then sold it in smaller quantities at double the cost. The Irish laborers had to sell their furniture, extra clothing and bedding, pigs, chicken, cows, tools, and fishing nets just to buy food. They borrowed money from money lenders called gumben who charged an interest rate from 20 to 50%. They wanted a fast profit. Letters were sent to the British government, but they were skeptical and thought that the reports were exaggerated. British people said the Irish brought the situation on themselves. So there was a Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel, and he served as secretary to Ireland. So he witnessed the Irish hunger when the blight destroyed portions of the potato crop. He established the government soup kitchen, public works, then gave the destitute an opportunity to earn wages by breaking stones, building roads, and digging ditches. Through that famine, there was always followed by deadly, highly contagious diseases such as typhoid fever, cholera, and dysentery. So in October, he sent 3 scientists to Ireland to gather accurate information about the extent of the crop damage and examine those potatoes. Wind and water and wind transported the fungus spores across the island at the rate of 50 miles a day, and it landed on the leaves, and spores germinated on the leaves and stems. The rain washed the spores into the soil, and when the potatoes were dug, the spores spread. The scientists, unfortunately, misdiagnosed the cause was as wet rot, insisted that the potatoes could be salvaged, and they wrote complicated instructions on how to care for the potatoes. They said to dry the potatoes in the sun, dig new storage pits, and use special packing material made from a mixture of lime, sand, turf, and sawdust. Insert rods to ventilate the pits, but the potatoes still rotted. Then they said to separate the potatoes into piles of bad and not so bad, cut out the black spots, grade the potatoes, wash and strain the gratings twice, dry the pulp on grilled over fire, make bread. Well, the people still suffered from stomach cramps, bloody diarrhea, and some of them died. So the potato harvest in 1846 revealed smelly sludge, and everybody panicked. Rather than the government providing food aid, Parliament introduced a new tax, which landlords would have to pay and raise money for the public work relief. It was a two-pronged scheme that would create work for laborers so that they could earn enough money to feed their families with food other than potatoes. Plus, it would provide for the work houses to be built to house the absolute destitute. The ruling class were alarmed and decided to bring a conclusion to their local problems by removing the burden altogether, by shipping their tenants to North America. Cost of shipping them was less than supporting that person in the workhouse for a year. The first ships were commissioned and loaded with human cargo for British North America or Canada. Each ship held an average of 300 persons, 2 to 3 times the number that would have been allowed by a port in the United States. And some ships were not seaworthy. And we're going to be talking about that later, about some of those ships. Ireland was officially in the Union with Great Britain, so it was subject to the so-called Corn Laws, which applied to all grains. They placed tariffs or taxes on the foreign grains to be imported into the United Kingdom, which included Ireland. The purpose of the Corn Law was to protect the British and Irish farmers from competition from German and U.S. farmers. The combination of laissez-faire capitalism and the Corn Laws hurt the early relief efforts in Ireland. British encouraged the Irish crop to be exported. The government imposed high taxes on foreign grain from the United States and Europe, and the taxes guaranteed profits for the farmers and merchants. Britain's Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel opposed the Corn Laws for humanitarian reasons. He wanted cheap imports and lower food prices in Ireland during the famine. Well, Peel knew that the Irish needed cheap food, and so he thought of the Indian corn, or the sweet corn, or the maize was one of the cheapest food that could keep the people alive. 2 pounds of Indian corn can make one stir-about supper for 6 people once the hard yellow kernels were properly milled and cooked. The stir-about is like a substitute porridge made from 1/2 Indian cornmeal and 1/3 rice, and it was cooked with water. Peel looked for a loophole. Since Britain had no existing trade in Indian corn, he decided that Indian corn was not affected by the Corn Laws. So Peel secretly decided to import a large quantity of Indian corn from the United States, and they commissioned the London bankers to purchase enough Indian corn to feed 500,000 people for 3 months. He had to do it secretly because the economic philosophy of the British government, called laissez-faire, that means to let do, or to let the people do as they please. So he purchased the Indian corn at great political risk, and it did backfire on him later on. American cargo arrived, and it was stored in 2 main depots at Cork and Limerick, and the corn would be sold in the spring when the food crisis would be the greatest. Peel created a relief commission, set up food depots, sold the corn at cost to local relief committees, about 2 cents for a pound of corn. And then in March of 1846, the Indian corn sold out quickly, leaving many people again without food. The Corn Laws hurt the economy of the United Kingdom more than they helped. If high taxes were removed from the imported grain, then people could afford to buy it, and the economy could grow stronger. Peel explained circumstances to Queen Victoria and urged her to support and repeal the Corn Law. Parliament members refused to repeal the Corn Law, and Victoria accepted their decision. And this angered Peel. He says, "Good God, are you to sit in the cabinet and consider and calculate how much diarrhea and bloody flux and dysentery a person must bear before it comes necessary to provide them with food?" I would love to have heard the rest of that speech. The Irish laborers discovered that the Indian corn was not a good substitute for potatoes. It needed special processing. It needed to be chopped in steel mills and grind the kernels twice in a regular millstone. When it was boiled, it spat steam and boiling water all over the kitchen, so the children had to be out of the room when it was being boiled. People suffered from terrible stomach pain, and some bled to death when the kernels punctured their intestines. Difficulty in digesting the maize, and it caused scurvy, which is a lack of vitamin C. and so it caused the bleeding gums and prevented wounds from healing. The Indian cornmeal became known as Peel's brimstone. It was the Peel's public work improvement for laborers could earn wages. And Peel expected landlords to contribute most of the money for the public works, but they gave very little. By summer of 1846, over 100,000 people had work on the road construction, built bridges, dug drainage ditches. So the men worked all day without eating. The overseer, the ganger, supervised the road constructor. And so this overseer would walk around cracking his whip. If man showed any slackness or weakness, he was fined at once. There might have been 100 men sitting on the boundaries to see if any man would drop out. Workers were fined for faults such as arriving late or slacking off on the job, losing 1/4 of his day pay. When men fell sick or died, sometimes their wife or children took their place. Relief workers were paid a daily wage, ranging from about 16 to 22 cents a day. And then there was a coin shortage. The relief committee could not obtain enough coins to pay the workers, and so there was a delay in payment. In June of 1846, Peel repealed the Corn Law, but his success made him unpopular, and 1 month later he was forced to resign from power as the Prime Minister. Well, then the person that took his place was Sir Charles Edward Trevelyan, was a British officer in charge of the relief efforts in Ireland. He viewed the Irish as lazy, stupid, immoral, and they brought the famine upon themselves. So-called moralists believed that the Irish were, as a people, were too dependent on others and would take advantage of the situation, but refusing to work, and would accept welfare pay from the English people. Suggested that the English would have more children just to increase the amount of their handouts. He also said that the real evil was not the famine itself, but the moral evil of the selfish, perverse, and turbulent character of the Irish people. So in 1846 was the worst year of the famine. The newspapers basically stopped reporting how many deaths there were. Ghost-like beggars stumbled along the main roads. Corpses littered the highways and the gutters of the small town and villages. So many people died that it was no longer possible to have proper burial. Mass graves were dug, and gangs were recruited by local authorities to collect the bodies and toss them into the freshly dug pits. Many died of starvation, while others died from illness. Starvation weakens the body immune system, which are the body's natural protection against the disease. Starving people lacked the strength to bathe, so the germs were abundant and spread easily. The famine also prompted people to flee from the countryside to the crowded cities and workhouses in search of help, which encouraged the spread of disease. Dysentery, a highly contagious disease that caused severe diarrhea, intestinal bleeding, and death. 47 was the worst year. Civil unrest, occasional rioting spread throughout a once peaceful countryside. The casualty mounted, the stench, the suffering, the sickness, and sometimes the barely still living were tossed into the communal graves. Entire families closed themselves up inside their huts, too weak to move. The living slept next to the dead. The grass grew high in front of their cottage doors. Family within wasted away to nothing. The law was passed by the British government that required soup kitchens to be paid for by the Irish tax money. The Irish were paying high rent and struggling to buy food and couldn't afford any extra taxes. Because the Irish couldn't pay rent, armed guards evicted thousands of Irish farmers and their families from their farms and homes. It took 4 months, 10,000 ledger books, and 80,000 sheets of paper, and 3 million soup tickets to establish the government soup kitchen. They bought huge boilers in which to cook the soup, a small quantity of meat, but chiefly vegetables, nettles, and herbs, and it was served with a piece of bread. And they thought the soup is ideal food. It was nutritious, inexpensive, and easy to make in large quantity. But the soup didn't supply the nutrients. So the lack of vitamins contributed to the outbreak of diarrhea and disease caused by scurvy. People walked miles to reach the soup kitchen. Some died along the road and while waiting in line or after they ate, because a sudden food intake often caused the malnourished body to go into shock. The soup diet was harmful to the people suffering from dysentery. And one of the comments, it says it ran through the paupers. In August of 1847, about 3 million people were being fed each day in those soup kitchens. In autumn of that year, the government shut down the soup kitchens because they expected the next crop of potatoes might be good, and told the poor people that they could go to the workhouses for help. So a short-lived soup kitchen. There were charitable groups and individuals also established the soup kitchen. Some gave soup, money, or clothing only to the Catholics who would give up their faith and convert to Protestantism, and the Catholics died on the road sooner than partaking of their soup. The U.S. Congress gave permission for 2 naval vessels, the Jamestown and the Macadamian, to transport food and supplies to Ireland. And the greatest amount of money came from the Irish immigrants already in the United States and Canada. In 1847, they sent over $300,000 to their homeland to help the Irish. So in 1847, the British rejoiced that there was a promise of the abundant harvest. In June, Lord John Russell replaced Peel as the Prime Minister. And Lord Russell was very committed to the doctrine of laissez-faire. People should be self-sufficient and not depend on government charity. The Indian corn ran out in the early summers, and he refused to import more. He argued summer months were the hungry months, at a time when Irish laborers were accustomed to less food and making do. Relied heavily on the opinions of Sir Charles Trevelyan, who was the permanent head of the British Treasury. So he decided that the Irish laborers were no longer need to earn wages by the means of the public work projects. So they closed in mid-August in time for the farmers and the laborers to harvest the early potatoes. So in August of 1847, the rains, the thunder, the fungus spores swirled in the air, and potato blight struck. 3/4 of the potato crops were ruined overnight. So the Irish had no food, the potatoes were gone, nothing left to sell, no Indian corn, and they had no work. Their grain crops, the wheat, the oats, the barley, and the rye, could have been ground into flour and made into bread and stirabouts, or oaten cakes, but those are the ones that were shipped, exported. So Sir Charles believed that the famine was the act of providence, effective mechanism for reducing surplus population. He called it called the crisis as a judgment of God. Largely responsible for the government's inaction in famine relief. His public works relief plan for Ireland had failed, And at its peak in February and March of 1847, some 700,000 Irish toiled about in useless projects while never earning enough money to halt starvation. He stopped the public works projects between March and June of 1847. And then Prime Minister Russell says to keep the people alive, feed people for free through soup kitchens sponsored by the local relief committee and by groups such as the Quaker and the British Relief Association, private charities funded by prosperous English merchants. So they were still trying to get money and food for these starving people. So Trevelyan and other Britons justified the economics belief with religious ones. God's way of punishing the Irish people for their poor morals and laziness. And then the British administrators took this even further. The Great Famine was a blessing that would correct the mismanagement of the estates by Irish landlords. Brit elites saw that the division of the Irish land among the middlemen, tenants, and laborers was an obstacle to modernization. They wanted to consolidate the land into larger farms so food production could be more efficient, productive, and therefore more profitable. So what was the result of the famine? Thousands died from hunger and disease. They faced epidemics of thyroid, cholera, with fever and stomach pains and diarrhea. Scurry became more of a problem. Irish began to examine the actions of the British government with food being exported out of Ireland. British owners of the Irish land were entitled to the crops grown on their land as the businesses relied upon these crops. Starving English people became furious as they watched boatloads of grain depart from their docks for England. Food riots erupted in the port in the southern Ireland, and people raided the government stores in Northern Ireland. British assigned military officers to protect and escort the ships in the Irish harbors. The British government created the Irish Poor Law Extension Act in June of 1847, made the landlords responsible for the famine relief, no longer the responsibility of the British government to help. The public works projects and the soup kitchens ended. The landlords were deeply in debt, and in 1847 the crops came in healthy, but few farmers was able to plant that year. Many ate the potatoes that would have been kept aside for planting to avoid starvation. Others were too weak from hunger to plant a large crop. Well, in 1847, harvest was about 1/4 the normal size, and the famine remained. People ate leaves of dandelions and boiled them. They strained the water off and made a gruel, but by putting coarse flour in the water. Because of the burden of the Irish Poor Law, some landlords had no longer afford the taxes on the small property and chose to kick out the tenants. Eviction was a complicated process and required legal judgment. If the judge ruled the landlord's favor, the family had to move out of their home. Crime rates rose as desperate people stole food from homes and stores hoping to get caught. They thought it would be better chances of surviving in a jail or in a British penal colonies in Australia than at liberty in Ireland. Rather than facing evictions, many choose to flee. More than 250,000 people were formally evicted, but the total number of people forced to leave their home was closer to 500,000 people. former farmers sought relief at the workhouses. The blight returned in 1848. After a season of heavy rains, the farmer didn't have money to purchase seeds for other crops, so they planted potatoes. Many of the Irish left for England or British North America or United States. Cargo ships converted to the passenger ships, but became known often as coffin ships. The trip took about 3 months, and many died before they even reached land. Those who survived had little to eat, often got typhus, dysentery, and other disease. Estimated death toll in Ireland was 1 million, and 2 million people immigrated out of the country. So in 1849, more bankruptcy landowners, they sold their estates and the land prices dropped. Well, the wealthy Irish farmers and some British businessmen began to snatch up the land at bargain prices. They increased the rent on the tenant farmers or evicted them. Homes were knocked down for more cattle-raising land, and the Irish farmers and laborers began to resist. In 1875, Charles Stewart Pennell was elected to the House of Commons, and he organized rural masses that was against the ruling landlord class to seek the 3 F's: fixed tenure, freedom to sell, and fair rent. The goal of the Irish was to own their own land. Land Purchase Acts in 1903 made the landlord system fair to the tenants. So it took a while for that to happen. So what are some of the health concerns of starvation? Starved person's body adapts by slowing its metabolism and survives on protein and vitamins and minerals that is stored in its tissues and muscles and bones. The brain slows down as the body wastes away. It's like cringing or childlike in manner. They stand at the window for hours with a vacant stare and moves only when driven away. Dehydration, hypothermia, heart arrhythmias, and infection were all increased. They felt an intense sensitivity to light and noise. And starvation caused psychological disorders. They were depressed, paranoid, hysterical, and they eyed each other with suspicion. And you can see what the starvation does to them, where you can see how they ended up eyeing each other with suspicion. So hunger edema causes the abdomen to swell 2 or 3 times its normal size, while the legs and arms waste away until they were very thin. Children suffering would resemble little old men, and women wrinkled and bent, bones fragile and muscles weak, so they couldn't even walk or talk. Hair falls out and thick downy patches grow on their face. They die from heart failure, kidney failure, shock, and diseases. Disease was spread quickly because of crowded cabins and stand in line at the soup kitchen. Lice jumped from person to person. These are some of the diseases that we had talked about. The typhoid fever, it's spread through food that comes into contact with fecal bacteria. And the symptoms are fever, muscle ache, headaches, possible a rash on the trunk or back, and diarrhea or constipation. The typhus, or the black fever, is more deadly than hunger. It's spread by fleas, lice that caught the disease from rats, and keep that in mind as later on we're going to be bringing that up. So the lice that caught the disease from rats. Okay. Symptoms include vomiting, sores, gangrene, and intolerable body odor. It attacks the small blood vessels in the skin and brain, causing the vessels to swell and block circulation. Blood vessels become so swollen that they burst and the victim's skin turns black. Within 2 weeks, the victim dies from heart failure. Another type of disease is relapsing fever. It's spread by lice. The symptoms are raging fever and vomiting lasting for several days, then profuse sweating and extreme exhaustion. A week later, fever and vomiting starts again, and the relapse can occur 3 to 4 times before the crisis ends. The cholera was infectious and almost fatal bacteria disease of the small intestine. It's contracted by the infected water supplies and severe vomiting and diarrhea. Scurry is a deficiency of vitamin C. Potatoes are rich in vitamin C, and so if they don't have any of the vitamin C, their teeth will drop out and joint swelling. The next disease is the dysentery, and it's a frequent passage of bloody stools. The disease is caused by dysentery bacillus, and it's spread by flies, by direct contact, or by pollution of the water by feces infected with a bacillus. Symptoms, they vary from mild attack of diarrhea to acute raging infection, nausea, aching pain in the limbs, and shivering feeling while there is always a fever. It kills more children than adults. Persistent diarrhea until the body wastes away to skeleton. The Cork City doctor said, loathing, putrid smell that surrounds the disease, as if he said the decomposition of the vital organs had anticipated death. To avoid infecting others, some would go and live in the scalps. So the Irish had no shame in living poor, but to be buried without a coffin was a disgrace and the ultimate sign of poverty and hardship. They died in the workhouses, and they were buried on ceremony in large pits. They had what they called a bottomless coffin. It had a hinged bottom. The bottom opened like a door and pulled and released the coffin bottom, allowing the corpse to drop into the grave. The coffin was used many times. Some people hid the bodies of their family, friends, and neighbors for weeks. They hoped to claim the deceased's food rations that were handed out by the government as part of the meager relief efforts. Travelers reported seeing half-starved dogs gnawing at the emaciated limbs of their diseased dead owners. The dogs were hunted by the starved people, which further spread the disease. So 1 million people perished for the want of food. The workhouses, the Irish Poor Law Act established the workhouses in 1838 and intended to provide shelter to those who could not work, the orphans, the widows, the elders, and the disabled. The British government tried to limit the number of people in the workhouses. The goal of the workhouse was to discipline the poor and to teach them the value of a meal through hard physical labor. The poor were fed, clothed, and disciplined. In return, they performed grueling and tedious labor. It's financed solely by the local taxes, which were paid by the Irish landlords and the tenants who paid poor law tax. Built like a combination between a military barracks and prison, bars over the windows and surrounded by the high stone walls with locked gates, varied in size and accommodating from 200 to 2,000 inmates. People entered the workhouse voluntarily, but they could not leave the grounds or quit without permission. Before the potato famine in 1845, the workhouses held 38,000 inmates. The second year of the famine, more than 500,000 people sought relief. Families were separated and sent to different wards. Families saw each other only during religious services on Sunday. The workhouses were dirty and overcrowded, and of course the disease spread. In 1847, the workhouse system had fallen into chaos. Full to overcrowding, had about 130 workhouses and housed over 100,000 people in total. Many Irish landlords and tenants had large amount of debt. They faced bankruptcy due to increased rates of taxes resulting in the relief efforts to stop. Family stories about the workhouses were badly treated in the workhouses. Food was poor and stingy. Those over them had no feelings for them. So their food, bland, two bland meals a day, usually milk, bread, oatmeal, stir-about, or porridge, and potatoes when available. Food was poor and sparing. The jobs, the men and boys replaced mules and horses in the work of turning mills, ground corn. Men and boys used the sledgehammers and broke stones for building roads and working on the grounds. Women and girls helped with cooking and cleaning about 10 hours a day. They scrubbed floors, knitted and sewed, washed linens, and tended the sick or elderly inmates and young children. Children attended class. Girls were taught to perform the duties of a domestic servant. They chopped wood, dug ditches. They crushed animal bones into powder for fertilizer, and this task was stopped after the guards discovered that the workers were eating the bone dust. In the summer of 1847, the government-run soup kitchens were supporting approximately 3 million people a day. And in the fall, in 1847, Trevelyan and the British officials began closing down the soup kitchens in effort to end handouts and for them to rely on for Ireland's poor law system. So the workhouses were again open to the starving masses. Conditions were so bad, the Irish took their chances on dying rather than entering one of the workhouses. So this was a picture that I saw. It says the greatest irony of the famine years. While the Irish people were suffering from the loss of their stable food crop, a bountiful grain harvest was ripening, but the laborers could not eat the grain that belonged to the farmers and landlords. They sold it to England and other foreign countries. So the evictions were another way for the wealthy landlords to clear the land of unwanted farmers. Tenant farmers and laborers were unable to pay the rent because they were too weak to work. So they demolished their houses. Men came and climbed up on the roof, pulled the thatch from the roof, tied a rope to the main beam. Other men pulled the rope and brought down the cabin walls. After the walls collapsed, the thatch roof was set on fire. Peasants left with only what they could carry, and most of the evicted died. They were starving, illness, exposed to the cold, wind, and rain. They lacked shelter, and they slept out in the open or in scalps. Here's another. You can see the picture of them being evicted, and heartbreaking. So this is a lot on this slide, but it's in 1847 there was a quarter-acre amendment, and basically is if you had a quarter of an acre, then you could keep that quarter of an acre to run the land. But the Gregory clause of that act required that the relief applicants surrender all but a quarter acre of that land. Many landlords were eager to clear their estates of the residents who couldn't pay the rent. Evictions increased drastically after the Gregory Clause was passed. Over 6 years, at least 250,000 people lost their homes, with greatest occurrence in the Kilrush Union. There was a Captain Arthur Kennedy. He was a poor law inspector for the Kilrush Union, was haunted by the evictions that he had seen. When I came back from scenes of eviction, so maddened by the sights of hunger and misery I had seen in a day's work, that I felt disposed to take the gun from behind my door and shoot the first landlord I met. Not all landlords were cold-blooded. Several reduced the rent and renounced rents altogether. Seamus Reardon's grandfather told his story when he went to pay rent and the landlord said, "Feed your family first, then give me what you can afford when times get better." So there are some good people. Small number of landlords participated in a scheme called Landlord Assisted Immigration. The landlords evicted their tenants and paid their passage to the United States or Canada, sometimes even chartered ships to transport them because it was cheaper to export the destitute than to maintain them for 1 year in the Union workhouse. Late spring of 1847, Major Dennis Mahan evicted over 800 laborers from his estate and gave them a free passage to Canada. Immigrants had to be hardy to survive the passage to Canada. Hundreds of people on the ship, from newborn babes to 90-year-olds, huddled together without light, breathing putrid air in filth, fevered people, lack of bathroom facilities, living without food or medicine, dying without the voice of spiritual consultation, and buried in the deep without the rites of the church. So in 1843, the voyage to Quebec took between 27 and 88 days. The British government did not intend for the Irish to starve, but they did not wish to enact laws that would interfere with the livelihood of the landlords, farmers, shopkeepers, and merchants. They would violate the principles of the laissez-faire. Landlords and farmers sold the grain to England and other foreign markets. They did so because they believed that they had a right to make a profit. Riots took place when people who were desperate for food saw the grain leaving the field to be exported. 500 people marched into Dungarvan County in Waterford, and the soldiers fired 26 shots into the crowd, wounding several people and killing at least one. They were in Pilltown. Laborers armed themselves with sticks, rocks, and spades and hammers and attacked a mill. They marched towards Ferry Point and attacked the barges and filled with grain and livestock, and was stopped by the British naval boats filled with artillery and the Marines. The Labor Rate Act in 1846, the cost of relief fell completely on the shoulders of the landlord and farmers. They were expected to pay additional taxes to support. The more workers that were sent, the greater the union debt, and the more rate they would have to pay. Overflow of the worker application, the project didn't start until late October and early November in 1846. So you can see the frustration that they had. So in Skibbereen, it was a magistrate named Nicholas Cunhams heard of the large number of deaths in the village of Skibbereen and took food and went to the area. Houses with no furnishings, no pots, stools, no dressers, no fire in the hearth. They found 6 famished and ghastly skeletons. Market day, the shops were filled with meat, bread, and fish for sale. The Irish people weren't starving because there was no food. They were starving because they didn't have the money to buy the food. Cummins sent a letter to the Duke of Wellington and begged the Duke to bring the plight to the Irish people to the attention of Queen Victoria. Also sent a letter to the London Times newspaper, and the letter appeared in December 24th of 1846. Wealthy British businessmen and merchants formed the British Relief Association, charitable organization that raised money for the Irish relief. Skibbereen was the worst area affected, 28,000 dead and 8 lost to the immigration. And on the grounds of the abbey, there were between 8,000 and 10,000 coffinless bodies that were piled in mass graves. The dying were dying too fast to get coffins made, and few numbers of the healthy people made proper burials impossible. The dying were burying the dead. In October 24, 1846, Dennis McKennedy died while working on the road, and he had a family of 5 with only 21 pounds of potatoes, and that was given by a neighbor, 2 pints of flour, and 1 cabbage. The decreased wages were 8d per day, and the sames were in rear for 2 weeks, so they owed him money. Jury found the deceased died of starvation owing to the gross negligence of the Board of Works. This is the only case of its kind in the Skibbereen district. People came to find food, but they died there. Workhouses became so overcrowded they built to hold 800 people, but housed over 1,400 people. 140 people died in December in 1846 and early 1847. So these are some of the stories that were shared. There were 6 inches of snow that fell in early November of 1846 and continued throughout December. Blocked roads, and canyon and smaller river froze over, and hungry laborers trapped mice, rabbits, badgers, birds, and they dug for edible roots. Mothers half naked, shivering in the cold, while children screaming with hunger. 300,000 workers trudged 5 to 7 miles each day through snowdrifts with spades in hand to work at the public works. Many workers were without shoes and coats. Workers staggered from weakness and hunger, and workers reduced to mere skeletons. Food prices rose. Took nearly 5 days' wages to buy 14 pounds of cornmeal, which would last about 3 days for a family of 6. They needed money to pay their rent or face evictions. These are some of the newspaper articles, and it talked about that Mahoney's article. Readers were shocked and horrified at the extent of the Ireland's famine and poverty. Editorials shamed the British government, calling its relief efforts a mockery. We have not done our duty by Ireland. Neglect, carelessness, and laissez-faire did not make a cheap system of government, but a very costly one. And the other picture is James Mahone sketched this mother as she begged for money to buy a coffin for her dead baby. Some other stories. The mother came into a shop, cradled a malnourished baby. He gave her some milk, but a day later the shopkeeper found the mother lying dead on a roadside, and the baby was alive. Mother had decided to feed an infant or the older son who would have the strength to work. The infant was removed from the mother's breast and allowed the boy to receive sustenance from his mother. Parents committed unthinkable acts of things that they had to do, emphasized the murder, suicide, rather than see their children suffer. The crimes, the stealing food from home, stealing seed potatoes from the food. Farmers sat up at night to guard their turnips, their cabbage, and livestock. Some stayed home from church on Sunday. Some dug dangerous man traps and trenches in the field that were 8 feet deep and 2 feet wide, and concealed it with brambles and grass. People lay in wait for the thief, and when the thief fell into the trap, he would beat him to death. If there was water in the trap, then the thief would drown. Watchmen arrested a 16-year-old for fishing in the river that ran through the estate. The boy later returned and dumped lime into the water, poisoning all the fish. The boy ran away, and boarded a ship to Canada. Some convicted criminals were sentenced to transportation or exile. They were shackled and shipped to Australia for 7 years of hard labor. So many people left before the blight, but 2 million people left during the famine years. They saved money for years, living in rags to purchase the passage ticket. Most were aided by families in the United States. Brokerage firm from Liverpool, England, established in the Irish towns too, and they posted these handbills promising plenty of work and high wages in the United States. Offered comfortable passages, good service, economic fares from $10 to $25. Most went to Canada, then headed to the United States because it was cheaper. Family left in the middle of the night for fear that the landlord would take their money. The journey to what they thought would be a better life. So the journey on the ship, they purchased the ship, and sometimes they had dishonest ticket brokers who cheated the naive immigrants with bogus tickets for ships that didn't exist. Many purchased the cheapest tickets, called the steerage passengers, which was located in the deepest hold of the ship and was only lit by lanterns. Ships often sailed overcrowded and carrying twice as many legal number of passengers. Many families left their belongings on the pier because there wasn't enough room on the ship. Spaces assigned, each passenger received a space no wider than 18 inches. Some ships were outfitted with as many as 4 rows of bunks from floor to ceiling. Spent most of the time below the deck, and they are allowed on the deck only in good weather. Passengers had little means to wash themselves and their clothes and bedding, so body lice spread quickly, transmitting ship fever, diarrhea, and dysentery from inadequate cooked food and putrid drinking water. They made frog bread by killing and roasting and pulverize a frog and mix the powder with the bread dough. By eating this bread during the voyage, it was believed that it would immunize them against the fever. And of course, in Ireland, they have the ghost and the leprechauns, and so there's a lot of imagination that was made it worse for them. Women used toilets located in either end of the steerage section, and the men used the toilets above deck. To escape the foul smell odor, the passengers stayed on deck as much as possible. Passengers died, the body was placed in a canvas shroud and buried at sea. The pastime, they played games, dancing, and the older children hunted rats, and now you can see the rats were the ones that were carrying some of that disease. The trip lasted about 40 days. If the trip took longer, then the water and the food rations ran short. Long voyages, the passengers became frustrated, frayed nerves, and quarrelsome. So they needed on board were the cooking pots, which allowed the families to prepare their meals at sea. And the rations of the food and the water were inadequate. Rough weather caused the ship to rock violently, causing seasickness, and cooking was not allowed on rough weather. The food on the voyage, each person adult received 1 pound bread, flour, rice, oatmeal, or potatoes each day, 3 quarts of water to drink, wash, and cook, and the children under 14 had half rations. They added vinegar to the water barrels, and the acetic acid in the vinegar probably slowed the growth of bacteria. And you can see a drawing of what it might have looked like. The women who wore long dresses could get their dress stuck between the ship planks. They would have to stay in place until the ship's weight shifted before freeing her. That would be scary. Not all ships that transported Irish immigrants from their homeland to the Canada and America were called coffin ships, but the term coffin ship was reserved for those that set sail during the famine of the 1840s, often unseaworthy, uncrowded, and nearly always with inadequate provisions of drinking water, food, and sanitation. The ships were intended to hold lumber rather than passengers, were not designed for comfort and safety of many of the passengers. Ships were remembered as coffin ships because many of the passengers died of disease, typhoid, dysentery while traveling on the ships. Many passengers were ill when they boarded the ship, and their illness spread in the dirty, crowded hulls. Immigrants who died on board were quickly buried at sea. Arrival at the port, the passengers were put in quarantine for weeks. Many died while on the dock ship during quarantine. One of the coffin ship was the Elizabeth and Sarah. It carried 120 passengers above her limit. So the ship would have had over 12,000 gallons of water, but it only had 8,000 gallons in leaky barrels. It took 8 weeks to reach Quebec, and 42 passengers died. The ship Larch buried 108 of its 440 passengers at sea, and then more died because they were stricken with fever. Approximately 2 million people left Ireland for the distant shores. Tenant farmers or the urban merchants or trade men's that could afford the passage were desperate to escape their broken country. And approximately 1.5 million Irish arrived in the United States between 1845 and 1855. In the port of New York alone, over 651,000 passengers entered Immigration Center at the Castle Garden. Other U.S. cities that took the people in were Boston, Philadelphia, New Orleans, Chicago. The passage to British North America, which is Canada, was cheaper than to the United States because some landlords, charities, and even government agents helped pay the cost of some of the tickets. Approximately 340,000 Irish sailed to the Canadian ports, and then many fled south to the United States. There was a passenger acts of 1855 was replaced the manifest of the Immigration Acts and the number of acts passed between the 1847 and 1849. And so that was used to regulate the shipping trade to protect the passengers. The Ocean Monarch caught fire 25 miles out of Liverpool, and it burned 24 hours and sank. 178 of the 400 people died. In 1849, Hannah struck an iceberg, and the captain and 2 officers left the ship in the only lifeboat, leaving the passengers and the rest of the crew to fend for themselves. 60 passengers died when the ship sank 40 minutes later. A passing ship rescued the other 129 people. So when you're in Canada, they underwent inspections in quarantine stations. 6 sick passengers were entered the quarantine hospital, and the ships were washed down with disinfection. And in 1847, over 100,000 immigrants heading to Canada, and 20,000 immigrants died. The orphan children were adopted or lived in orphanage. The large influx of Irish immigrants overwhelmed the United States inspection officials. In spring of 1847, 40 ships waited in line. Many had fever and dysentery. And in 1847, Congress quickly passed that Passenger Act, which we had talked about previous, was reducing the number of passengers on the ships. U.S. refused ships with passengers too sick or too weak to work. Ships were then sent to Canada, and Canada was the British territory and couldn't refuse the ships from Britain or Ireland. So 1852 marked as the end of the Great Famine, but the hunger remained a problem for years. The Irish economy had suffered greatly, had no money or energy to help revive Ireland. Few Irish farmers could pay their rent or produce a large potato crop. Landlords fell deeper in debt and began to sell their estate. Many Irish did not improve significantly until many years later. And by 1852, approximately 3 million Irish had either died or moved away. And so it was an artificial famine. Why was there a famine at all? And we had gone over, so this is just kind of a review. The presence of the food was not enough to keep the famine away. Ireland was producing enough wheat, oats, and other food during the famine years to feed its population. Britain's harsh and oppressive rule over Ireland was the laissez-faire. The British government did not take any active role in relieving the suffering. It did not stop exports, nor did it seize Irish crops and distribute them throughout the country. Impoverished Irish people had become so dependent upon only one crop for their survival, and that was the potato. When it failed, there was no other substitute. Ireland's wheat, oats, and other crops were grown on good soil and could be exported overseas by the wealthy landlords. But the Ireland's severe poverty, more than half of the people of Irish people had no land of their own to grow their own food. Some of the crops were sold to local Irish markets, but the Irish people simply could not afford it. When the supply was limited, the price of the food goes up. And there wasn't a way to distribute the food around the island. Those hardest hit by the famine were isolated in the west and southwest of the island, and the main source of food crops were in the center or the southeast. Morale was low, and poverty and illiteracy were high. Famine is not about the lack of food. Famine is about who has access to the food. So some of the changes that were occurring in the United States. So between 1845 and 1850, the largest group of immigrants during this time were the Irish, to escape the starving and go to a land of hope. And so they would come in on Ellis Island. There's industrial revolution, farms replaced with steel mills, clothing factories, and other industrial buildings as the cities began to grow. The largest number of Irish immigrants coming to the United States as a result of the potato famine settled in Boston, Massachusetts, and in New York City. Port cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and New Orleans became overwhelmed with new arrivals from Ireland and the disease and poverty that brought with them. Immigration from Ireland took their entire fortune and experienced extreme poverty. Irish arrived and met by runners, who were people that tried to carry immigrants' bags and bring them to the apartment housing in the city. They charged high fees for their service. New immigrants were more often confined to city slums and apartments in the poorest neighborhood that were overcrowded, noisy, and dirty. Because of the great prejudice in the United States, Irish clung to each other for support, and they became stronger. They lived in communities where they preserved their language and their religion. Even if they had a job, they lived in small, dirty apartments, which led to sickness and early death. They settled near one another in densely populated Irish ghettos. Stereotypes of the Irish made the Atlantic cross as well, happiest with their drink in hand, dishonest thieves, potential violence, and all contributing to an unwillingness of some quarters to hire an Irishman. So the stereotypes preceded them. People worried that the Irish would take the American jobs, feared that they would be too weak from hunger and disease and can't work, the fear of typhus and other diseases. To prevent this, the employers refused to hire the Irish. When they did get a job, they ended up doing jobs that were the least desirable jobs that no one else would do. They worked in lumber camps, building railroads, rivermen driving logs, granite quarries in Maine and New Hampshire, digging canals and railway roads, factories, mills, and coal mines. And the wage was 50 cents a day. But look at it, the public works in Ireland was 16 cents a day. So no Irish need apply. Many fought in the American Civil War, and women were worked as maids and servants in American homes of the wealthy. Many babies born to the Irish immigrants lived in New York City in the mid-1800s died. Some people thought that the Irish, Catholic Irish, were agents sent by the Pope in Rome to take over the United States. Immigration continued to rise even though famine ended in 1852. There were fears of future famines and dissatisfaction with the British rule and continued to drive the Irish from their land. The United States economy was fast growing and promised plentiful jobs and high wages. So you can see here that no Irish need apply. So the Irish in the America, the gold rush drew thousands of Irish from the city in the east. In Chicago, the Irish butchered meats in the slaughterhouse. In San Francisco, the Irish opened up shops catered to gold miners. Irish brewed beer with the Germans in Milwaukee, forged steel in the Pittsburgh and the Philadelphia area, and helped build New York City's subway system, as well as bridges, tunnels, canals, and railroads. They worked on the iron beams in the shipyards, and they mined coal in the western Virginia. The Irish in America sent money, what they had, to their families and friends in Ireland to pay for their voyage to America. Over time, Irish showed that they were hardworking and they gained respect in the United States. American shifted their dislike for the next arrivals, and that was the Jews and the Italian immigrants. So the legacy of the Great Famine reduced the Ireland's rural population. Wealthy landlords were able to consolidate their holdings at a great cost. Estates were in poor shape and such debt that they were no longer profitable. Tremendous labor shortage existed throughout the land, and entire villages and towns were abandoned. Stone walls of the ruined cottages were a reminder of the Ireland's great tragedy. After the famine, Irish were dissatisfied with the British rule and called for their own independent government. And that's what happened with Easter Rebellion in April 24th of 1916. And there's a lot on this slide, but they had that rebellion, and Pierce was one of the people that started it, and they ended up killing him, and 15 others were killed. But as a result, they ended up, the British government finally rejected the idea of the Irish Republic, and then they had the army, and then by June of 1921, the British recognized that the war was becoming too damaging, and victory would cost an extreme loss of life and would damage the British reputation. So the Northern Ireland split from Ireland in May of 1921, and the British agreed to formation of the Irish Free State in December of 1920. So it took quite a while for them to have the independence that they needed. There's a lot of monuments that are around England and the United States and Canada that recognize the potato famine, and this is one in Ireland. This is the one in Dublin, the statues, and this is the one at Skibbereen, Ireland, and this cemetery became one of several Irish famine pits or open graves in which corpses of the dead were heaved and eventually covered over with thin layer of clay. Estimate that 8,000 to 12,000 people were laid to rest in those pits. They had just a lot of gravestones, but this was its remembrance of the Irish lost generation. And it says, where in humility and sorrow, not mixed with indignation, one is driven to explain, oh God, that bread should be so dear and human flesh so cheap. At the height of the disaster, over 60 people a day were dying from typhus and yellow fever at the Skibbereen workhouse. And that was hard. So some of the other signs, it says, to the nameless dead victims of the famine and fever who lie here in the Abbey and other cemeteries on a wayside grave. Pause if you can almost hear the sounds of the echoes down of the ages, the creak of the burial cart, the rattle of the hinged coffin door, and the sigh of the spade on the earth, now and again, all day long. And this was in memory. While the British people starved and died of fever and dysentery, the English government continued to ship boats loaded with grain from the Ireland, food that could have been used to sustain the hungry. This was an interesting display, and it's 110 bronze spoons. And 110 teenagers were sent in 1848 from Skibbereen to Australia. And the girls were sent to provide labor, marry, and have children, and help colonize the continent. And there was two aims for this scheme, Earl Grey Famine Orphan Scheme. It was to reduce the overcrowding in the workhouse through assisted immigration schemes, and 60 people a day were dying in the Skibbereen workhouse, which was widespread with disease. They would send females to Australia, the ratio of 9 men for every 1 woman in Australia. The girls didn't have to be, that were eligible for this, they didn't have to be an orphan. They were age 14 to 18, not living with family, be of good character, unmarried, without children. Each girl received 2 dresses, 2 petticoats, 5 pairs of stockings, 2 pairs of shoes, a Bible, and a spoon, a bowl and a spoon. And approximately 4,000 girls left the country during this scheme. So that's why they put the spoons up, which I thought that was really a nice memorial. Then this is in Boston, and you can take a look at and see what how the Americans were looking at the poor, the Irish, and so that's a monument on Washington Street and School Street. So, and this one got a lot of flack. It says, arriving in Boston in 1847 alone, 37,000 Irish refugees landed in Boston on the edge of death and despair, impoverished and sick. Native Bostonians might have been willing to send money and food to aid the starving Irish as long as they remained in Ireland, wrote historian Tom O'Connor, but they certainly didn't want them to come to America. The newcomers moved in along Boston's waterfront, packed together with damp cellars and overcrowded hovels. Children in the Irish district, wrote Boston, literally born. They seemed literally born to die. This was in Quebec in 2019. The remains of 21 people who lost their lives on the Carriage ship, the bones came up on land. And so what they did is that was a coffin ship, and 48 out of the 173 passengers were able to swim to shore and reach the shore alive. The bones of mostly women and children were found on the beach between 2011 and 2016, and they what they ended up doing is they had a memorial for that. So the famous Irish Americans, Henry Ford, he left Ireland in 1847 for Dearborn, Michigan, and of course he's the founder of Ford Motor Company. Thomas Francis Meagher was convicted by the British government in leading a failed rebellion in Ireland and was sentenced to death, and Queen Victoria changed his punishment and exiled him to Australia, and he managed to escape and come to the United States. And he ended up settled in the northern states and defeated the Union, the 69th New York Infantry, and the Fighting 69th, made up of entirely of Irish immigrants. So he was responsible for that. There was Elizabeth Jane Cochran. She was a traveling journalist, and she worked in uncovering in the mental hospital the exposures of the poor conditions. And of course, John F. Kennedy, elected in 1960 to become the 35th president of the United States, and he was the first Irish Catholic president. So today the Irish celebrate by holding parades, wearing green. The four-leaf clover is a symbol of good luck. The Cornish corned beef was used as a substitute for bacon by the Irish immigrants in the late 19th century, and the corned beef and cabbage is an Irish American variant of the Irish dish of bacon and cabbage. The British invented the term corned beef in the 17th century to describe the size of the salt kernels used to cure the meat, the size of a corn kernel. After the Cattle Act, salt was the main reason Ireland became the hub for the corned beef. So this is usually when I do a presentation, I end up having food. So this is the food that I'd made, and my husband and I ate it. So it's the Irish soda bread, and this is and those pancakes are called boxty. They're potato pancakes, and they were very good. So the handout has those on if you are interested in making those. And this is thank you for listening. It says, honey, I want to thank you for being so attentive tonight, and wait a minute here. And you can see the potato head there. So I appreciate you listening. These are some of the books that I used in the research, and I'm just very thankful that you were able to listen and to be able to learn about the potato famine. I learned so much, and it was just some of the things were really, really hard to listen to because of the way the people were treated. So I appreciate it, and thank you very much.